The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And welcome to 2024, Joel. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, and as you may notice, we now have new digs, which we think look a lot better, and really good people working with us. So
big shout out to ClickMo, our buddies Angel and Jason. Glad to have you on the team. And as you can tell, the production quality has improved quite a bit. Higher quality definition, right. More camera angles. So hopefully that will be a great backdrop for what we want to talk about for the year. So here's what we thought we would do. We thought that would make sense for the start of 2024 to walk you through what we think are the biggest issues that we're going to be facing in 2024 and around which we will be creating new shows. So Joel and I have both put together our top 5 list, and we thought we'd walk you through. Joel, you want to start with your biggies?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're going to start off with education. Obviously makes sense since we do work for an educational institution. And of course, the big issues there are really, let's face it, the education system is in terrible shape. You can start with Harvard, but you can go all the way down to the kindergartens in the elementary schools. One of the big problems is kids are coming out of school, particularly kids from poorer families with very few skills, very little knowledge. And of course, you don't have to be poor to be ignorant, because a lot of rich, ignorant people out there. But the reality is that we are facing a educational crisis for the first time, maybe in our history. We have a generation coming up who, in many ways, is less educated than the generation before.
Well, the thing that hits me about the education question is, what is the purpose of education to begin with, right? If you look back in history, to become educated meant to become a leader in society. And now with the world of social media, the world of almost leaderless society, it seems as though the role for education is changing. So we're wondering, if education's changing, it's changing because of market forces. One of the big questions we have is, what is going to happen, and this is on my top 10 list, what is going to be happening to all of those high-end professional jobs that we've been training people for in our educational institutions? Are they going to be there? Are we going to have them? And if they're not going to be there because AI or some other technology is taking them over, what is the role of a university education? What is the role of vocational education? It's going to be a really interesting question.
Yeah, and I think you raise the issue of AI in particular, because when we think of, let's say, new technologies, first thing we think, well, it's going to be the Amazon warehouse workers. It's going to be the person working at Walmart who's going to get it, or the person working at a GM factory. But increasingly, it's going to be the very people that we've been saying as an educational institution, go get your STEM degree and your life will be a jolly one and you'll always make money. That's not the case anymore. And we really don't know what the social impact of AI is going to be. Marshall and I are teaching a class at Chapman on this spring, and I think it's a major question. I think the impact on the class structure in America and the impact on education is going to be profound. And I think new models of how we organize our economy and how we organize our education system are going to have to be developed. And we hope to bring in this year lots of people who have different ideas. Some people are starting new universities. Some people...
Yeah, there are new models that are coming out about how do you actually create a new university, and what is it really all about? I mean, the thing that is, I think, underlying a lot of the assumptions that people have made over the years is that if you have a university education, it's going to put you in the leadership class of society. Well, do we still have a leadership class of society? I don't know whether we do or not. And what's the model of a university if that leadership structure has really fundamentally changed?
And we've even seen the beginnings of that. If you think about the people who are shaping our society, many of them are college dropouts. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs being probably two of the most prominent ones. What you're seeing is that maybe we have to go back to the idea of apprenticeship, about learning by doing. I mean, just from my field, the journalism, somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, you know what? I have a degree from Columbia Journalism School," and my response is the typical New York response was, "That and a subway token will get you a ride on the subway." Subway tokens is how you used to pay for subways.
Before apps, before the digital economy, right?
But you really have to see that people are really in a situation where they really don't know what's happening. And I think when we look at, for instance, what's happening at Harvard and many schools, it used to be you went to Harvard, I knew you were smart and you had a good education. Do I think that now? I'm not so sure.
Well, the whole issue of Harvard and the controversy around the elite schools, the fundamental assumption at Harvard is that everybody should have an education because then they have an equal shot at achieving, as opposed to ensuring that everybody has the same outcome. That's where I think we've seen the corruption of the educational system, is that we've walked away from the notion that education should be about giving everybody an equal opportunity to prove their mettle, to prove what they can do. And so I think we're in for some major shakeups there.
Yeah, and I think that people are going to look for alternative institutions. And that's something we're going to be covering this year, is very interested in people with new universities within universities, and even some very more radical models, which many of our colleagues won't like because they won't have tenure and they won't be the sort of cushy jobs that, let's face it, academia has provided.
So what's your number two issue?
Well, I would say that the issue of what's happening with net zero, I think that's going to be a constant. And what we're seeing now, and I saw it, it's really been clearer in Europe than here, is to get to net zero in the time frame that they want without nuclear power and with solar and wind is just a fantasy. It's just not going to happen anything like in the schedule that they want. And there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. You don't have to go very far to see it. You look at California with the number of people in energy poverty, because of the state policies, trying to phase out nuclear power, trying to phase out natural gas. Well, those are the sources of reliable energy. And
so the question really becomes, is the trade-off between achieving net zero and the economic problems that come along with trying to get there in as strident a way as we've seen thus far, is it really worth it? And I think that this is a question people are asking that is a very legitimate question about, do we really want to put this cost, this economic burden on society for what appears to be a relatively marginal gain in terms of our impact on the environment? And
just one last point, which is very critical, is, and this has become very clear in Europe, is that the shift to EVs, electric vehicles, what it really has done is hand the automobile industry to China, which totally dominates it. And the great irony is that domination is powered by coal and by unclean energy, if you want, or the least clean energy that you could find. So fundamentally, what we're looking at is, in order to achieve an impossible goal, we're going to wipe out all these jobs, and in the process, hand the economic future to our biggest rival. Somehow, it doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense.
Well, and Joel, the other thing, in my take, my number two issue really is related to that, which is, can you really walk away from the infrastructure that we've built in the 19th and 20th centuries in favor of completely remaking it with a new infrastructure, whether it's energy or whether it's bridges, whether it's roads? We need to figure out some way of being able to maintain that infrastructure. Otherwise, we're going to have complete chaos in the shift over to completely new infrastructure. Nobody's complaining about the notion of having new infrastructure, new ideas, new technology to move society forward, but we can't do it at the expense of throwing away the base that we've built that allows the economic engine to thrive.
And I think one of the really philosophical questions is those of us who think that we still need economic growth, we have a lot of people who are poor, we have a lot of people who are struggling. Can we have an economy that lifts people up? Very, very difficult to do it in an environment where we're not building infrastructure that makes us stronger. You know, when we go to the historical experience of the New Deal. Now, the New Deal, there's a lot of debate about how right the New Deal was as a solution to the Depression. But one thing we do know is we would not have defeated first the Germany and Japan in World War II and then the Soviet Union if we didn't have the best infrastructure in the world. And it's very hard to say today that we have the best infrastructure in the world. We really have to redo how we do our infrastructure and what we're doing. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a lot of money on things that are going to be very difficult to achieve at the cost of things that will help people today. It doesn't help America, and it doesn't help, particularly working people, to not have a modern infrastructure in order to reach some unrealizable goal. I just think that we really need to think about not just what infrastructure we need, but how we build it. And I've just been, and we'll deal with this question right now in the sense that it's taking us so much money to do things that even in other countries they do easier. You look at the California high-speed rail; it's just a joke. I mean,
the railroad to nowhere that costs $100 billion.
Right. Which was supposed to cost, a fraction of that.
But, you think about these, that's a really great example of a wishful thinking infrastructure where, you could have invested in other areas to improve the transportation system without that huge cost overrun.
Always would have made sense to me, this is not just for California, but I'll use a California example, which is we have the trains that go along the coast. It goes into all the downtowns of all through the Central Coast, Santa Barbara, up to the Bay Area. Why didn't we just modernize what we already had instead of building something? And the problem is, and the studies that I've worked on, what they say is the reason is because you build new infrastructure, there's more opportunities for economic advancement for people who are well placed. I won't necessarily say that it's just wastage and corruption, but we should think about being reasonable, like maybe fix the roads that we have, fix the bridges that we have, fix the trains that we have. I mean, one of the reasons people don't take the train, let's say, from here to San Diego, is that the trains are late a great deal of the time.
Right. And part of that is because we haven't paid attention to the infrastructure.
Right.
We haven't paid attention to the fact that we get, landslides along the coast in Southern California that screw up the train schedule. So if we had spent a little less than the $100 billion that's being spent on the high-speed rail and just created a new rail line through slightly interior of Orange County, we would have a very effective train system.
And to our friends in New York, anyone who's looked at the Second Avenue subway, which is incredibly expensive, why not fix the subways that we already have? New York's population's not growing. We already have a tremendous subway system, but the fact is, and I'll call this out directly, people felt that this would be a great way to increase the property values in the richest parts of New York, and meanwhile, people who are living in Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx have to continue to ride on very inadequate trains. I think we have to, when we look at infrastructure, you have to look at priority, what works economically, and also what helps people who are trying to achieve upward mobility.
Well, and that's actually a great bridge to the next issue, which is this bridge to upward mobility that everybody in the world wants to have. That's creating huge pressures across the globe in terms of their frustration with the unevenness of economic growth. And so I would think that one of the third thing that's on both of our minds, I know, is how are those pressures going to play out? What do you think? What's your worry about how that's going to play out?
Well, one of the things that we know for certain is that many developing countries are not going to go, all renewable energy. Many of these countries, particularly in Africa, don't even have adequate electricity now. And they've been pushing back. India is another example where they're saying, wait a minute, you can't tell us that, we now have to give up what you already have. I mean, we're going to have to figure out ways, and maybe technology will help here, so that the rising up of the developing world, which is going to happen, which is inevitable, cannot be controlled. Can we do it in a way that doesn't destroy our economies?
Well, and also, are we on the cusp of a third world war over all of this?
Well, that's one of the big topics we're going to be looking at. I mean, and I think you have to go to many, many things. I mean, obviously, the Ukraine war, which is not turning out so great, that is for the really almost something out of World War I, or at least World War II. We haven't seen anything like that in Europe. Obviously, the conflict in the Middle East, which very easily can expand to Iran, to Yemen, to Jordan, to Lebanon. I mean, so there's that. And then there's one that I think is not getting attention, but I think one of the things we will want to focus on is Venezuela deciding that it's just going to march into Guyana,
yeah.
and become a true oil superpower. What would we do? I mean, one of the questions we want to look at is the United States even capable of stopping these things? And obviously, you also have China's possible takeover of Taiwan. Is the United States military, and we're going to go to friends of ours who are or have been in the military, are we up to it? Certainly our European allies are not in great shape. The German army has 2 days' worth of ammunition. If the Russians win in the Ukraine, they could probably, the Poles are going to stop them from getting to Paris.
Well, the funny thing is that if you look at what it takes to make the resupply of anybody's weapons, whether it's German weapons or whether it's U.S. missiles, you have to rely on a supply chain. Where does that supply chain start? Oftentimes in China.
Including for our most advanced fighters.
So one of the things that we have to look at, and we're going to be scheduling sessions, I think, for the Feudal Future podcast on this, is the breakdown of the traditional regional alliances, the NATOs, the OASs, from a political point of view, and the realignment around supply chain and economic forces that is inevitably going to come out of all of this. I think that is a huge restructuring that we're going to see a lot of action on in 2024.
And I think it's tied, again, to the infrastructure issue. As we found during the pandemic, we couldn't even produce masks. I mean, the only way I was able to get masks for my family was to call a friend who called somebody in China who shipped them to us, and then I was handing out masks to my neighbors and to my family. The richest country in the world, the most technologically advanced country in the history of the world, should be able to make masks.
You would think. But, when you start looking at the supply chain and you start looking at the global nature of it, and actually probably the Asia-centric portion of this, largely driven by China, it kind of brings me back to the era of naval dominance by first the British Navy in the 1800s and then the U.S. Navy in the 1900s. The U.S. Navy has secured global free movement of goods arguably since World War II, maybe before World War II. I wonder whether or not that role is going to be moving to the Chinese Navy. No, and what's the implication of that?
No, I agree. And I think that unfortunately, we're at a crisis where it would be nice to have a Churchill or a Roosevelt or a Truman in power, and basically we just have a bunch of mediocrities and lunatics running against each other.
Well, and let's take a specific example of this. Let's take the Houthi rebels disrupting traffic going into the Red Sea and ultimately the Suez Canal. The U.S. and European allies have said, well, we're going to create a task force to make sure that stays open. But when you think about it, the people that actually have the largest vested interest to keep that open are China. And so you wonder, well, what's their role going to be in all of this? How does China get placed? Are they viewed as kind of a upstart aggressor that's taking over the South China Sea, or as a broader global power when it comes to naval power? I think this is going to play itself out during this coming year quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we're going to do is we're going to bring experts about China, because obviously there's no point in getting the Chinese government involved. Even if they would go on it, you really wouldn't believe a word that they say, because they're not in the business of providing truthful answers, particularly on an issue like this.
Yeah. Well, speaking of regional issues, one of the big areas of our own research that we're spending a great deal of time with at Chapman University is the rise of Latino prosperity. As Latinos move into plurality and majority status in many areas of the United States, what is the future of the Latino population going to be looking like? How do we assure that this engine is a successful one for the economic growth of society?
This is particularly important because the demographics in America, population's aging. The children are a lot of them are heavily Hispanic. Half of the school children in California are Hispanic. How they do is going to determine how we do. I try to make this case, and there are some people in the business community who get what we're saying, which is, if the Latinos fail, we fail. That's the bottom line. It's not a question of social justice or making up for something that happened in the past. It is about the future, and we're really hoping, and we're getting some good support as well from the university to say, look, we want to figure out what is the way towards upward mobility of Hispanics. So we've gotten an extremely great team of people, 4 Latinas, as it turned out, who are looking at these issues like education, like jobs. When you eliminate, let's say, just an example, you decide, well, California should not be the entry point for goods for the whole country, which it is now. Only serve California. Well, you're going to lose tens of thousands of good blue-collar jobs, mostly from Hispanics, and also in the Bay Area from Indian Americans, who are very dominant in the trade in the Oakland port. What do we do with this? And that, yes, it's a Latino issue, but it's really an American issue, because you look at the 3 states and really the 4 states that are most important in the United States: Florida, Texas, California, and New York. All of them have very strong Latino communities. In the states of Texas and California, probably at least a plurality and maybe a majority. And we believe that the Latino community should not be viewed as a threat, as something that we should be afraid of, but as a tremendous opportunity for upward mobility in this country.
And especially entrepreneurship.
Yes.
Because if you look at the motive power that is going to drive Latino success and then ultimately U.S. success, somebody has to buy in to the notion of taking risk to build businesses. Because that's what creates jobs. That's what creates the wealth that is able to be spread across the rest of society. And it appears to us that there are impediments that we're putting in the way of entrepreneurial activity. And that's going to affect Latinos very heavily, because for like a lot of immigrant groups, the route to prosperity is through entrepreneurship. And so we want to see what can we do to make sure that is a smooth road. And so even though we're not looking for assurance of outcome
Right.
We're looking for assurance of equal opportunity to succeed.
And I think that that's something what we don't want to see in the United States, and we'll deal with this issue somewhat as well, is that in Europe, where the large population of people from the Middle East are not making progress, and they're it's really becoming a major crisis for European societies. And we think America is better than that. I think America is designed for new people to come in. How many Americans are come from families that didn't get here till the 20th century, and a lot of them even in the 21st century. America is a country that survives by reinventing itself, and if we stop reinventing ourselves and we get stuck in the mud, we're going to be in terrible shape. And you know what? If that's the case, Europe has better food and better architecture, so we might as well just give it up.
But this does bring us to kind of the issue that you and I have talked about a lot. That is, I think, one of the largest issues that we face, and that is the lack of trust in any kind of institution, whether it's a government institution, a business institution, any kind of social, religious institution. We're seeing unprecedentedly low levels of trust in what we historically have led the ability to grow the economy, to grow society, and how do we work our way out of that?
And right now, about 4% of the American population thinks that the political system's working, and let's face it,
it isn't.
It isn't. When you think about this, the vast majority of Americans, about 60%, do not want Donald Trump against Joe Biden.
Right.
Donald Trump is, in my mind, is an unhinged narcissist with dangerous tendencies, and Joe Biden is too old, too out of it, doesn't have a very clear vision, was probably never particularly smart to start with, and so he's obviously deteriorated. And I have to say, as someone who's now turned 71, I know what I'm not capable of compared to what I was capable of even a decade ago.
But to some degree, that's irrelevant. The real issue is it's time to get off the stage.
Yes.
It is time for the next generation to step up and take over. And look, there is a whole panoply of characters that are on the stage that are reasonably sentient,
right,
reasonably qualified. It's time to get somebody who's less than 80 years old, and it represents the newer generations, to step up and take over. And that's going to be huge as we go into 2024, because obviously we've got the election looming. And at this point in January, it's hard to see how we're going to have a Trump versus Biden rematch when nobody in the country really wants that.
And I've just finished an article about this, but if you look at the younger people, they don't want Biden, they don't want Trump, and the same things have happened in Europe. Some people vote for the left party, some people vote for the right or far right parties, even in a liberal country like the Netherlands, and our political system is simply not responding to the needs and to the views of the younger generation. And the last thing I would just say on this, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, I don't think we have found a way to use the value of older people. I mean, I think we're not worthless. I think that the experiences that we had, the things that we learned, plus a lot of us, particularly in the boomer generation, are products of the huge investment in science and education that was made during the Cold War. Particularly.
So we may have screwed it up for you, but keep us around a little longer.
Right.
We have some value.
Right, but we don't have a way in the society to value older people, as has happened in traditional societies. We don't have that way. So my sense of both Biden and Trump is that, and you can say McConnell and Schumer and the almost all of them, Pelosi always had the sense to step down. We have no place for the contributions of older people. So older people hold on to power. because they figured that the moment they're out of power, nobody will talk to them, nobody will interest them.
Well, so there's obviously a clear answer here, and that is to replace the entire political structure with an AI.
Okay. Well, at least those are some jobs that maybe we can afford to lose.
Right. So AI, that actually brings us to kind of I've never thought about the idea of having an AI president. That could be really kind of a cool thing. But AI is the other looming issue that we want to tackle and in our show in 2024. I think both you and I are on the fence about AI. We see a lot of the potential value to create productivity and efficiency, but we're worried that it's going to come at a humongous human cost of unemployment and disruption. So what's your sense on that? Let's preview that a little bit for the year.
Okay. I mean, one, obviously, AI and applications of AI are going to have effect on a lot of blue-collar jobs. That we're pretty sure of. Warehousing jobs, jobs in retail, jobs in the factory floor. But what's going to be really interesting is how many of the high-end jobs are now going to be done by AI.
If you can have AI deliver code or deliver spreadsheet analysis that might have been done by a $100,000 a year plus person, why would you code?
And then of course there are in the creative fields, maybe you don't create artificial versions of living people, you just create completely artificial versions. I mean, there are influences with hundreds of thousands of viewers who aren't even real people. So I think there's a tremendous threat to the creative and the technological communities, and how do we deal with that is something that's a great challenge. And of course, at the same time, we know that AI can make for some very, very good things in infrastructure development, particularly in the medical field. So it's not all negative, but one of the things that we're going to be hashing out, I think, all year is what are the effects of AI. And the last thing that worries me the most, and it fits into the very idea of the feudal future, is AI. Unlike the internet, AI seems to be completely dominated by a small group of very large companies. We're not seeing lots of companies that came out of the digital revolution in the 80s and 90s when I covered Silicon Valley, covered what was happening here in Southern California, where we had all sorts of new companies emerging. Now AI seems to be pretty much Microsoft, Google, a handful of companies with a dominant role. And the biggest fear I have for America and really for the world, but particularly for America in the next 10 to 15 years, is the creation of essentially a permanent oligarchy of a handful of companies who dominate everything. When I hear of Amazon wanting to get into healthcare, and we already can see how the digital companies are buying up the entertainment industry and the publishing industry, it's a very frightening prospect, because I think the biggest threat to democracy is the concentration of wealth and power. And that's been my consistent view for quite a long time. And I think, when the United States was founded, it was understood by the founding fathers that small property ownership and diffusion of power was absolutely critical. And we're moving in the exact opposite direction. And one of the things we want to explore is there any way of stopping it?
Well, we will be bringing a bunch of guests to our show. Hopefully you will enjoy them over the course of the next year. But if the feudal future were ever an issue before, it is certainly an issue today. And we really hope that you tune in to the Feudal Future podcast, and we look forward to a great year with you. And thank you for being such loyal members of our audience.